friends, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So, apologies if I sound a little nasally and congested. I am currently in the process of getting over a cold. I'm basically better now, but still a little on the congested side, so bear with me on that for this episode. But I want to officially welcome all of you to 2024. I know in the last episode I wished you all a happy new year, but at least as of when that episode came out, it was still technically 2023. So this is the official first episode of 2024, and I'm thinking that this is probably going to be a pretty good year. I'm not sure about you guys, but I'm pretty pumped for this year, so we will see where the road takes us. Now, I'm assuming by this point, seeing that we are officially now in 2024, a few days after the new year, I'm assuming that most of you are probably done visiting with family at this point, unless you're one of those college kids that you get like a month off of school around the holiday season, in which case you may or may not still be visiting some family. I guess it kind of depends on what your living situation is at school. But in any case, I hope all of you got to enjoy some quality time with your family. I know I sure did. And any of you out there that you are your family's entire IT support staff, I hope you're able to find at least a nice balance between being on call as tech support and actually getting to spend quality time with those you love, because I know especially on Christmas that can be a really hectic time for those who have the unofficial title of IT support staff in their family, because all they're pretty much doing all day is helping the family get their technology working that they just got for Christmas. I know personally, I was able to find a really good balance between the two, being able to provide some technical support as well as, getting to spend quality time. But one thing that I did find kind of funny was it seemed like a decent amount of the time when I was thanked for my technical support, I was just kind of sitting there like, what did I do? Because from my perspective, I really didn't do anything. And what I mean by that is it's not like I, was, say, watching TV or playing a video game or something, and then put that down and went over to, certain relatives, laptop or iPad or phone or whatever the case is, and try to like troubleshoot and diagnose an issue in order to fix it. I kind of just gave some kind of either remark or suggestion that worked, and I got thanked for my technical support. So I don't know, maybe some of you fell into that category, but seeing that you are listening to the podcast, I would assume that you are fairly technologically savvy, so I would kind of think that you would probably fall into that role of maybe not the sole IT support for your family, but definitely one of the cornerstones of the IT support in the family. So with all those pleasantries and intros out of the way, let's get into this week's trivia question. And I think this one is amazing. And of course, it has nothing to do with the fact that I'm very biased and love the Apple Xserve. This week's trivia question is: the Xserve, which was released in 2002, was originally called the Rack Mac and shipped with what CPU? So what CPU shipped in the very first Xserve or Rack Mac back in 2002? And that is your trivia question for the week. Now, as far as some interesting news that happened while we were all away enjoying our fantastic holidays, Google got slapped. Well, I guess they didn't get slapped with. They were currently in a lawsuit with users. You may have heard about this a while back. It happened back in June when the lawsuit was originally filed, June of 2020, actually, where users claimed that Google was misleading their users by tracking their activity when they were using incognito or private mode on their web browsers. And because of this, Google has decided to settle for $5 billion, that's billion with a B, in this lawsuit. So, I mean, I guess for Google, that's probably, oh no, I dropped $10 on the street. Oh no, big whoop. But yeah, $5 billion, quite a hefty sum. So this class action lawsuit, that's what they were seeking. They were seeking $5 billion in damages. And basically they were alleging that Google was tracking them in their incognito mode. Google was basically saying that they consented to this because they're using our search engine or browser. But the court did not see it that way. Users, I mean, the reason why most people use incognito mode, some of them think that search engines like Google or social media apps like Facebook or Instagram or any of the other ones can't track them when they use incognito mode or private browsing mode. That, of course, is not what's happening. Basically, if you're unfamiliar with how private browsing or incognito mode works, it essentially doesn't keep or store any of your cookies when you're navigating between browsing instances. So for instance, if you're using a regular web browser and you're not in incognito mode, this is what will allow you to, say, sign in to X account, and then you can close out of that tab, and then a few minutes later go back to that same website and you'll already be logged in because those cookies are stored on your device and in your browser's data. But incognito mode essentially deletes all those once you're done with the session, and doesn't keep those between sessions, unlike a regular web browser. So it does nothing to mask your identity or mask your IP address whatsoever. That is a little bit of a common misconception, I think, when it comes to incognito mode and private browsing. But regardless, Google basically tried to get the lawsuit dismissed, basically pointing out that there was a message displayed saying when users turned on Google or Chrome's incognito mode, their activity might still be visible to websites you visit, which, yes, that is true. But as we'll see here in the judge's ruling, they said, quote, Google's motion hinges on the idea that plaintiffs consented to Google collecting their data while they were browsing in private mode. Because Google never explicitly told users that it does so, the court cannot find as a matter of law that users explicitly consented to the at-issue data collection. So, yeah, because of this, Google is going to be forced to fork over some of that cold, hard cash, and honestly, I don't think this will be the end. I think Google will probably, again, try to find some sneaky ways to harvest as much data as possible, since that's kind of what they do. Since basically their main revenue stream is their Google AdSense and selling ads, and the best way to sell ads is to sell targeted ads, and the only way you can sell targeted ads is to have a bunch of data on everyone. So yeah, but I thought that was an interesting bit of tidbit news. I'll have an article linked down in the show notes if you care to peruse that any further. And with that, let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. So this week's cybersecurity tip kind of falls in line with other tips we've discussed in the past, but a little bit different, and that being that you should always verify packages and extensions before you install them. I can't tell you how many times I'll be browsing through some cybersecurity news and I'll see another article about some NPM package or some PyPip package or some other Python package or some other extension, causing malware. Browser extensions are chief among them as well. There's so many instances out there of these, packages and extensions that you can install that basically are nothing but malware or packaged in spyware or whatever you want to call it. There's a bunch of bad stuff out there. Yeah, and I can't tell you how many times I've seen, articles and news stories about, these malicious packages ending up within these, stores or app repos or whatever you want to call them. So the best ways that you can protect yourself against this is, first and foremost, check to see if the package or extension that you're trying to install is open source. And if it is, go look at the source code, because if you look at the source code, you can verify for yourself that there's nothing spooky going on. That's one of the beauties of open source. Now, I think it also has to go without saying, just because a project is open source doesn't mean that it is free from all wrongdoing. There are some open source projects out there that might not have a lot of followers, to not have a bunch of eyes on it, or whatever the case may be, and could potentially be harboring some kind of malware or otherwise malicious code, or potentially have security vulnerabilities in it. So just because a project is open source, that doesn't automatically give it the green light, but it definitely is a step in the right direction. But with it being open source, like I said, that gives you, the user, the opportunity to go and look at said source code and verify that nothing sketchy or spooky is going on behind the scenes. And this, honestly, if you wanted to make the argument, could be a great excuse to learn programming and learn software development, so you can analyze open source projects to verify that they are actually legitimate. There are plenty of people that make careers out of that. They're called security researchers that will, that's basically their job, is to look at code and audit code and look for potential vulnerabilities, and all that stuff. So that's definitely one recommendation I would give. The second recommendation is to stick to vetted packages and extensions. So some stores will have a verified badge or some other way to verify that this extension is legitimate. Other ways is if the extension or the package has a lot of, good reviews or is well known or well used in the community. That's also a good sign. Basically, what I'm saying is you want to be hesitant of those packages that basically have no reviews or very sketchy or questionable reviews. Those are the things that you potentially want to be mindful of. Other things is if it's kind of looks like a ripoff of another wider, more well-known extension, that could also potentially be a red flag. So just be careful of what you're downloading for your extensions and your packages. Make sure that they are legitimate. And that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. So a couple weeks ago on the Christmas episode we did, I talked about the Apple Watch Series 9 and Ultra 2 being banned. Well, it turns out that Apple somehow managed to work some magic and, at least temporarily, get them back on the market. So Apple won a temporary pause on the ban, basically through the U.S. Court of Appeals. So now Apple is at least temporarily able to re-import Apple Watches and be able to sell them. If you recall, originally there was this ban put in place because the Apple Watch's blood oxygen sensor had a patent infringement battle with Massimo. I believe that's the name of the company. So Apple basically so they came out essentially with a software update to essentially try to resolve the issue. Personally, I find it kind of hard to believe that that's going to go through if the hardware sensor is still the exact same one from the patent. Because you can tweak the software all you want, but if the hardware component's the same, I'm not sure if that's going to fly. I mean, it might. I guess we'll see. So this temporary victory that Apple has that allows them to be able to resell the watches again, it puts the ban on hold until January 10th. So, like I said, they believe the software update should fix the issue, and the government, I guess, is expected to rule on that on January 12th. If it's actually going to be valid and go through, or if Apple is basically going to have to go back to the drawing board on that one and try to figure something else out. So I guess, which is funny because before I saw this headline, I was actually looking on eBay to see if the prices of Apple Watches had gone to the moon yet. And to my surprise, they hadn't, and they had been, pretty reasonable, and I was like, that's kind of weird. And then, of course, I see this headline talking about how the Apple Watch, the ban has been temporarily halted thanks to the Court of Appeals. So if you're interested, I will leave a link to this article down in the show notes as well. And with that, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So I guess really it's been kind of 2 weeks since I last updated you on some nerdy things, and to be honest, it was very low key. I mean, I did do some nerdy stuff, but like I said, a lot of spending time with family and whatnot. But one thing that I did do was I wrote myself a game of life simulator. And I bet you can't guess which language I used and which graphics library I used. If you guessed C and Raylib, wow, it's like you read my mind and you know me too well. So if you're not familiar with the Game of Life Simulator, I'm not going to go into like all the details of how it works, but essentially what it is you have a matrix, if you will. You have a 2D array, a grid of pixels, however you want to define it. And each one is essentially in an on or off state, or a 1 or a 0. And then based on the rules of the game, which essentially boils down to if there's like 2 to 3 neighbors, the space is alive. If there's less than that, the space dies. If there's more than 3, it also dies. And if the space is dead and it has exactly 3 neighbors, then it comes back to life. I believe it's something around there to that effect. So basically what you do if you want to write your own is you basically keep track of the board, and you're probably going to want to have 2 boards. If you're thinking this in the graphic sense, you can think of this of having your front and your back buffer, so you can essentially do what's called double buffering. And basically the point of double buffering is you display the front image while you're updating the back image, and then you flip them. So then the back image is now in the front while you update the front image, and then you just keep flipping them back and forth. That way you can reduce your overall memory footprint, so you're not recreating new arrays every single time you need to update it. So helpful tip there. But basically how it works is you iterate through the entire 2D array, and you basically check all of the neighbors around the given space. So it's pretty simple and self-explanatory on how you do it, although you do have to keep track of the edge cases. That, of course, being if you're at spot 0, 0, you're not going to have a neighbor above you or to the left of you or in the upper left corner of you. or the upper right corner of you or the bottom left corner of you because you're in the top corner. So you have to account for some edge cases. One way I've seen people kind of overcome this is to kind of streamline the code. They'll essentially add a wraparound effect. So if you are essentially in the first row, rather than ignoring the left because there's nothing to the left of you, you essentially take the last column and kind of have a wraparound effect going on. And you can pretty easily do that through modulus operations or using the modulo operator, which is essentially taking the remainder of a division operation. And that can help you easily wrap around. So then once you kind of do all that magic of updating the screens and updating the arrays, then it's just a matter of displaying those pixels to the screen in however fashion you want to do it. I, of course, went a little over the top and added a config file to basically allow you to set the screen size and what resolution you want. And basically the resolution is how big do you want the squares to be. So you can have them either really, really tiny and have a lot of them, or you can have them really big. And then you can set the screen size to basically more or less whatever you want. So it is kind of nice and customizable that way. One thing I also had thought about doing but never actually did because I didn't think the performance was all that terrible was I was thinking about multi-threading it because one, it's me, but two, I thought it would be a pretty trivial thing to multi-thread in the sense that it works really well for multi-threading because if you think about it, you basically have this massive 2D array, right? So what you could easily do is you could divide it up into halves, into quadrants, into any number of little small segments and just have each thread focus on that one segment, and you wouldn't have to worry about any kind of race conditions or anything like that of threads trying to manipulate the same data at the same time because they're only focused on their particular area. And one of the reasons I kind of scrapped it was because depending on the screen size you set, you're probably not going to see a performance increase. You'll probably see a performance decrease because of, the overhead of spinning up threads and whatnot. And I had thought about just having like continual threads that like essentially don't die and just constantly run nonstop. But I hadn't actually gotten around to implementing it. But I did notice when I did a full screen test on one of my computers with really, really tiny block sizes, I did notice it got the CPU, one thread of it anyway, going at a pretty good rate using a decent amount of processing power. So it potentially could be a thing to throw in there for more of a what the heck because I can type of a thing. But realistically, I don't necessarily think for most cases it would provide that much of a performance increase. But I think just for the fun factor of it, I might do it anyway. But we'll see. That is definitely something to come in the future. As far as other things I did do a little more programming on my video game. It was very minor since I was, like I said, I was kind of home and I was working on this Game of Life simulator. Of course, I have a project that preoccupies me from my other ones. But I did kind of do some minor tweaks and minor updates. Basically just adding additional states to the state machine because that's a large part of what video game development is just state machines and checking what state you're in. If you're interested in learning about state machines, we talked about it a few episodes back. In one of the episodes, you can go listen to that if you haven't already. And now I'm probably going to sound like a bit of a broken record. Especially if you've listened to the podcast for a while, but it never ceases to amaze me how absolutely incredible it is to have a home lab that you can access from anywhere. And now some of you might be droning on like, oh boy, here he goes again. But I don't know. Like every time that I am away from home and I can VPN in and have access to all of the horsepower in my home lab, have access to all of the services that I run, even when I am away from my house, vacationing with family and friends, I can just bust out the old laptop, crank out some coding, and sync those changes with my private GitLab instance, and it is absolutely glorious. And I know this is not the first time I've mentioned it, and it will definitely not be the last time either, but it never ceases to bring me joy to be away from my house, sometimes even in different states, and still be able to access everything like I was plugged directly into my home network through an Ethernet port. It is absolutely incredible. Now, of course, the speeds that I can connect to things isn't going to be as fast as if I was directly connected into my network. But hey, I mean, I still have access to everything I want to do, and it's not like I'm going to be transferring gigabytes upon gigabytes of data between my laptop and my NAS, for example, if I'm not home. Because if for whatever reason, I did need to do that, I would simply just wait till I got home to not have it take forever. So yeah. The last thing I want to talk about was, I guess, some of the IT technical support staff stuff that I did over this break. So at my parents' house, they still have the old family computer that we had from. It's been a while, back from the Windows Vista days. It was brand new and shipped with Vista, so that'll kind of give you a sense of how old this thing is. It's rocking an original first generation Intel Core series chip, so it's definitely been around a while. And this computer had a little bit of an issue. It wouldn't turn on. And when I say it wouldn't turn on, I mean like you press the power button and absolutely nothing happens. Like no lights, no nothing. And usually if there's an issue with your computer and you press the power button, you'll at the very least get some kind of flashing LED on the power button or some kind of beeping or something. But this got absolutely nothing. So at first I was like, okay, this is probably the power supply. But I wanted to try to double check, although I didn't really exactly have an extra power supply to check with. But I was fairly confident it was the power supply just because I mentioned, like, if you have a bad RAM stick or your CPU's dead or you have an issue with your motherboard or something, you're more often than not going to get some signs of life rather than absolutely nothing. So we ended up ordering a new power supply for the system, and I got that all swapped out and switched over. And then, of course, wouldn't you know it boots right up. Now, of course, it took a while to boot because it's still running a spinning hard drive in it, so it's not the fastest computer, but it still keeps chugging along. The one thing that I found so interesting about all this was the fact that when we first got that computer, I remember that thing being absolutely blazing fast. Like nothing could touch this thing. Like it was like the cream of the crop. And now it's like, man, this thing is it's chugging a little bit. It's kind of slow. Now I think a large part of that has to do with the spinning hard drive in there. I'm sure if you threw an SSD in there, it'd probably, I'm not going to say it's going to, win any drag races or anything, but it'd probably at least be somewhat serviceable. Probably not for Windows because it's not supported in Windows 11, like a lot of computers aren't supported in Windows 11. But seeing that it is 64-bit, I mean, you could probably put Linux on there if you wanted to, and and keep using that thing for many, many years. But that's not the use case of that computer, so I'm honestly not exactly sure what's going to happen to it. But regardless, it at least has a little bit more life in it now that it got at least new to it, power supply. So that was some of the nerdy things that I did this week, and I hope that you guys also got to do some nerdy stuff with some of the downtime you had, either from school or from work. Hopefully you had some time off and maybe got to play around with some nerdy things this week or these past couple weeks. And that kind of leads me in to, I guess, kind of what I wanted to wrap up this episode with, and that is, a lot of people, come the beginning of the year, they do some kind of, what's coming in 2024 or the new year, or their predictions for the year or something like that. And I thought about it, and I thought about maybe trying to do like a predictions thing and be like, these are the things that I predict are going to happen, and then at the end of the year, we can kind of do a look back, see what I got right, see what I got wrong. But I figured that I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to, be all mainstream, I guess, if you will. So instead, I want this to be, I guess, be a challenge to everyone out there that this is going to be the year of the personal projects. Now, if you've listened to the podcast for long enough, you'll know that one thing I champion almost more than anything is the absolute power of personal projects and how incredible they are and why you all should have them. I distinctly recall mentioning at one point that if you don't need your own personal development team to manage all your personal projects, you don't have enough of them. So if you don't need a personal development team to manage all your development projects, this is the year for you to pick up some more personal projects. Now, when I say pick up more personal projects, I don't want that to be you decide to go off on some endeavors to make these massive projects. You work on it for like 2 weeks and then you abandon it for something else, never to come back to it again. No, what I want you to do is to come up with personal projects, whether they're programming or whether that's something in your home lab, installing a new service, playing around with a new piece of hardware, learning networking, whatever the case is. Find some personal projects to not only entertain you and allow you to have some fun, but also to build your personal and professional development with these IT tools and these programming languages to make yourself, I guess, more marketable, if you will, if you want to get all businessy. But the big thing is, find some kind of project you're passionate about, whether that's making your own video game, although that could be a little ambitious depending on the scope, whether that's creating a game of life simulator, whether that's creating a game of war simulator, whether that's, writing your own command line interface tool to do something for you, whether that's writing automation tools or automation scripts, whether that's writing Ansible playbooks to automate everything. Whatever the case is, find some personal projects this year and really put the pedal to the metal on those and really, make some progress, make some headway, push those things to your GitHub, get those projects out there, because one of the best one of the things that I love about, software development in the open source community is some of the absolutely incredible projects there are out there. Like, we mentioned a couple episodes ago, all the open source well, not even all, but a lot of open source projects that I use and absolutely adore. And that wouldn't even be possible if someone out there didn't have the idea one day to be like, hey, I want to make this project, and started working on it. Now, granted, a lot of the big projects out there, a lot of the big open source projects have tons and tons of contributors and whatnot, and it's not just one person working on the code necessarily. But I mean, if you think back to, say, the origins of Linux, right? Linus Torvalds was at one point the only developer for the entire Linux kernel. Now, of course, now it's one of the biggest projects on GitHub, and there's tons and tons of contributors, well over 1 million commits to it at this point, and it's definitely one of the biggest open source projects out there. But it started because one guy had an idea. He had an idea for a project that he wanted to make, and he set out and did it. So let that be an inspiration to you that you might not necessarily write the next Linux kernel, for instance, but, maybe you'll write a project that, maybe it's just something that you find useful, or maybe others will find useful as well. But the goal that I want this year to be is to be the year of personal projects, because I find great value in them. I always think they are fantastic learning experiences. And one thing I would also like to add on to that is, whether you're, doing a software development-based personal project, or whether you're doing a more homelab services, hardware-based personal project, is be sure to keep good documentation. Because documentation, while I will admit it is a kind of a pain in the butt to write sometimes, you will thank yourself later when you haven't dealt with the thing or have to come back to it in a few months or a year's time and you kind of forget what happened. If you have good documentation, whether that's comments in your code or you wrote up a wiki on how to configure something, you're going to thank yourself later when you have to come back to that and figure out what you did. Because I can't tell you how many times, I forget when it was, but it was a few months ago. I had mentioned I started essentially my own homelab wiki, where I was basically writing up quick documentation about how to do various things as far as configurations go in my homelab. And I can't tell you in how many times I've gone back and referenced things that I've written up for myself as guides or how-tos or whatever the case may be. How many times I've gone back to that documentation and found what I was looking for basically right away, rather than having to, surf the internet for another hour and a half or 3 hours or however long it would take just to find what I was trying to do that I had already done before because I neglected to write it down. So whether you are installing a new service or whether you're installing a new piece of hardware in your home lab, definitely be sure to document, what you do, because not only is it good for you to help remember what you did in the past, but it's also a fantastically marketable skill that enterprises will love you for if whenever you, implement or install a new service or system or whatever, if you document exactly what you did, even if you're long gone and off to your next adventure, if you wrote up that documentation, whenever that system or service needs to be serviced, they can look at that documentation that you wrote and figure out exactly what you did to install it, how you configured it, and all the work you put into it, and you just made their lives a heck of a lot easier. So even if you might not feel like you necessarily need the documentation, it's definitely a really good habit to get into, to write up even the most basic of documentation. Now, I'm not saying that if you're working on a personal software development project that you need to go out and write a 65-page requirements document with a 120-page design document. Absolutely not. That sounds atrocious. Now, if you want to do that, then I definitely implore you to go ahead and knock yourself out. But personally, that's not kind of the documentation that I enjoy making. Although that would be potentially very beneficial depending on how large in scope your project is. Like if you're, I don't know, maybe writing a video game, for instance, it could be potentially beneficial to have a little more in-depth documentation of how all the different components kind of work together, especially once you start to scale up the project, because let's be real, if you're writing a video game by yourself, it's probably easily going to be a multi-month process, if not a multi-year process, just to get this thing, in a playable state. And by that point, you've written so much code that that there's a decent chance you don't remember exactly how all of it works and how all of it fits together. So if you have some kind of documentation, mentioning that of how everything fits together, that could be beneficial. So if you wanted to make a design document, that could definitely be beneficial to you. But at the very least, I would recommend doing some kind of documentation that would allow you to have, whatever your IDE of choice is, be able to tell you what certain functions, classes, or variables mean and reference and do. So if you're using Java, that would be like implementing Java documentation into your code. If you're using like C++, doing like Doxygen style comments in your code, or just whatever the documentation standard for whatever language you're using is. More often than not, if you have an IDE or an integrated development environment that supports that language, it should pick up on that. So you'd be able to essentially hover over a function or start typing the name of a function, and it would give you kind of a description of what the function does, the variables it take in, what those variables are supposed to represent, and what the function returns or what it does, whatever the case may be. So at the very least, I would definitely highly encourage you to do at minimum that, because then you could at least see, you'd be able, at least say if you were working in an object-oriented language, for example, you could create, whatever classes you need to, and then you could start typing the names of functions, and if you didn't quite remember exactly what they did, you could just, quickly glance at your documentation there and see, oh yeah, it does this, that's the one I need. Or no, that's not the one I need because that returns an integer value, but I'm actually looking for the float representation or the string representation or whatever the case may be. So that is definitely beneficial there as well. And at the very least, when it comes to documentation, I would encourage everyone to at least write a basic README. If you're not familiar with what READMEs are, it's basically if you go to any GitHub or GitLab or any Git repo, chances are, well, not all cases, but there will be some kind of README file, which is basically kind of a quick synopsis of what the piece of software does, how it works, how it runs, how to build it, for instance. So at the very least, especially if you're going to put your projects on GitHub or GitLab or some other open source site, I would highly recommend that you have some kind of README that gives a basic overview of what your project does and what it's trying to accomplish, as well as how to build the project and how to run it. So if you're using like a compiled language, chances are you could potentially just say there's a make file, just run make. Or if you have a more complicated project, maybe you have make run or make release or make whatever your specific instance is to build the runnable version of the program. And then, of course, you want to have some instructions on how to run it, because, yeah, it's cool that your project's open source, but if no one is able to build it and run it except for you, its usefulness could potentially be questionable. So it is definitely nice to have at least some kind of a basic README to help you remember and to let others know, what your project's doing, how how to build it, and how to run it as well. And that is definitely something that could potentially benefit you in the future too, since there have been instances where I have come back to a project after a few months' time, and because I neglected to do any kind of like README or anything for it, I forgot what I had to do to actually build the project. Now, most cases there was a makefile included, but I didn't always have the default setting to actually potentially build the executable that I wanted it to. So I then had to go through the makefile and figure out what I needed to type. So having at least some kind of basic README to give those basic instructions to help not only you know what to do, but help others know what to do is definitely nice. And again, if you have this on, say, your public GitHub or your whatever you're incorporated into your personal profile, for example, that's going to be definitely something that employers are going to look at and take notice of. And if they can see that you are an absolute boss at writing quality documentation for your code, that's going to be something really attractive to them, because quite honestly, a lot of developers are absolutely horrendous at documenting their code. Now, I will admit, I occasionally do fall into that trap, and don't get me wrong, it's really easy to do because, you just get in the zone, hammering, banging out code, being an absolute code monkey, tearing up that keyboard, and you just get into the zone, get into the groove, and just write code all day nonstop. And it obviously all makes sense to you in the moment. And because you're on such a roll, you don't want to, stop and, make comments and stuff. You're like, oh, I'll just do it later. And then later never comes. And then you got, thousands of lines of code with not a single comment in sight. So I understand it definitely happens to all of us, but if you can have the discipline to well document your code and document your processes, that's going to be something that's super attractive to potential employers. And it's also going to be you're going to thank yourself later when you have to come back to your homelab service you installed or your personal project you're working on, when you inevitably get dragged into another personal project because you thought it would be cool to implement. And then you inevitably come back to your other project and forget what the heck you were doing. I can't tell you how many times I've been there. So yeah, this is going to be the year of the personal projects. I encourage all of you to pick up some personal projects, maybe find some new ones, keep working on the ones you have, and just find time to make progress on them. Even if it's only like an hour a day or a couple hours a week, that really starts to add up over the course of a few weeks, a few months, a year. So just keep hammering at those personal projects, keep making progress with them, and of course, be sure to document it well, not just for your own sake, but for the sake of your future self. And if you are intent on potentially publishing this and making it completely open source for everyone to view, the more documentation you can put into it, the more people will thank you later. So yeah, that was kind of, I guess, my charge for this year, for 2024, is let's all get out there and work on some absolutely fantastic personal projects. And if you've never coded a day in your life, well, it's a new year, it's a new you. What better time to start than right now? So that is going to do it for this episode. But of course, we have to get back to our trivia question. I, of course, will not forget my beloved Xserve, and that is the topic of this week's trivia question. So this week's trivia question, as you'll recall, is the Xserve, released in 2002, was originally called the Rack Mac and shipped with what CPU? If you said the PowerPC G4 7455, congratulations, you are correct. And this CPU in particular came in either 1.0 or 1.33 gigahertz variants, and you could have either one or two in your server if you wanted to be a baller. So basically, all Xserves, had the option of having one or two two CPUs in it. In this case, you could have had one or two of those PowerPC G4 7455s. I'm sure back in 2002, they were probably the bee's knees, but of course nowadays they are ancient history. So that is going to do it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, of course, leave it a rating and review. Subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. And be sure to share this around to all your friends and family members, especially your developer friends or anyone that's up and coming, to potentially give them some motivation to get them started on some personal projects, because like I said, this is the year of personal projects. So if you have any questions or comments about the show or have any suggestions for future episodes, shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. And that is going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.